It was the day after my high school graduation, a day I had imagined in countless daydreams throughout the years, a day when the world would finally open up to me, a day of excitement, freedom, and possibility. I had expected cheers, celebratory hugs, and the overwhelming sense of accomplishment. What I didn't expect was the conversation that would change everything, the conversation that would mark the end of my childhood, and the beginning of a much harder, lonelier reality. The morning started like any other. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow through my bedroom window. I could hear my parents downstairs clattering dishes, talking about something mundane like the weather or the garden. The house felt familiar, warm, and safe. Everything I had known for as long as I could remember. I was in a daze, still absorbing the fact that I was no longer a student, that I was officially an adult. My whole life had been building up to this moment, and it felt like the world was waiting for me to make my next move. My parents, though, didn't seem to share the same excitement. When I walked into the kitchen, they were already sitting at the table, their eyes not filled with pride or joy, but something more serious. My dad's expression was hard to read, but my mom's face was tight, the muscles in her jaw clenched. Something was off. Yeah, I know. I've been thinking about it a lot. My mom cut in before I could say anything else. You've been thinking about it, but we haven't heard anything concrete. What's your plan exactly? I hesitated. I had spent so many hours in the last few months thinking about my future. But the truth was I didn't have it all figured out. There was a moment of silence, and then both of my parents stared at me, their faces hardening. The tension in the room grew heavier, like the air itself had become thick with anger and frustration. I had no idea how they would react, but I never imagined it would be like this. Are you kidding me? My dad said, his voice sharp. A gap year? What does that even mean? You want to waste a whole year doing nothing? I opened my mouth to protest, but my mom interrupted. This is exactly why we've been pushing you so hard all these years. You can't just keep avoiding responsibility, Rachel. You need to take life seriously. I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't that I didn't understand their concerns. They were always the type to believe in hard work, in following a clear path. Morning, kiddo, my dad said, but there was no warmth in his voice. He looked at me briefly, but quickly shifted his gaze back to his coffee mug. Morning, I replied, though I already knew something was wrong. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating like a storm was about to break. I grabbed a piece of toast, trying to pretend everything was normal, but I could tell that wasn't going to be the case. Sit down, my mom said, her voice unusually stern. We need to talk. I did as she asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I sat across from them, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of the table. I had no idea what was coming, but the look in their eyes told me it wasn't going to be good. You're at a crossroads now, Rachel, my dad said, finally speaking up. His voice was calm, but there was a certain finality to it that made my heart race. You finished high school, and it's time to figure out what comes next. I nodded, trying to calm my nerves. Everyone expected me to go straight to college, to follow the path my older cousins had taken, to follow the rules. But the idea of jumping into another 4 years of structured learning felt suffocating. I didn't feel ready for that kind of commitment. I wanted to take a break, to travel, to experience the world outside of textbooks and tests. I wanted time to figure out who I was outside of the pressure to perform academically. I've been thinking about maybe taking a gap year, I said cautiously. I want to travel, maybe get a job, and really figure out what I want before I make any big decisions. They didn't see value in taking time off to find myself. It was frustrating, though, because I felt like they were just pushing me toward something I didn't want, without considering how I felt. I'm not avoiding responsibility, I said, my voice more confident than I felt. I'm just trying to figure out what's right for me. I don't want to rush into something I'm not ready for. My mom's eyes narrowed. You don't get it, do you? You've been sheltered your entire life. College isn't a choice, Rachel. It's a responsibility. It's what you have to do next. I felt my pulse quicken. The conversation wasn't going in any direction I had hoped. I don't see it like that, I said softly, trying to keep my emotions in check. I want to have some time to breathe before I make a decision like that. My dad let out a long sigh, his face growing darker. You've been breathing your whole life, Rachel. It's time to grow up and face reality. You've had enough time. We've given you everything you need to succeed. But if you can't see that, then you're not going to be here any longer. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I froze, staring at him, unsure if I had heard him correctly. What do you mean? Not going to be here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You're an adult now, my dad said, leaning back in his chair, his expression stone cold. You want to go on some gap year adventure? Fine. But you're not doing it here. If you can't follow the plan we've set for you, then you'll have to figure it out on your own. My stomach dropped and I felt a rush of panic. Wait, you're kicking me out? My mom crossed her arms, her face hard. We've been clear about what we expect, Rachel. We've done everything for you, but you're not respecting our rules. If you want to make your own decisions, then you'll have to live with the consequences. You're on your own now. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to argue, to shout, to cry, but nothing came out. My mind was spinning, and my heart felt like it was being torn in two. How had it come to this? How had the people who were supposed to support me, who had raised me, suddenly become the ones pushing me out into the world without so much as a second thought? I stood up, my legs shaking. I don't know what to say. There's nothing more to say, my dad replied. You're an adult now, Rachel. It's time to start living like one. You need to find your own way. I left the kitchen without saying another word. My thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. My graduation had been a moment I had dreamed about for years, but now it felt like a cruel joke. I had no idea where I was supposed to go, or what I was supposed to do next. The one thing I was sure of was that I couldn't stay under this roof any longer. As I grabbed a few of my things, throwing them haphazardly into a bag, I knew that my life was about to change forever. But at that moment, I didn't know just how hard it would be. I walked out the door, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. The air was thick with disbelief as I walked away from my childhood home, my mind racing in 1,000 directions. It was surreal, the suddenness of it all. One moment I was celebrating the end of high school, looking forward to a future that seemed wide open, and the next I was forced out with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of uncertainty. My parents had given me no options, no second chances, no time to even process their decision. They were firm, cold, resolute. They had made their choice, and now it was my turn to face the consequences. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where to go. My thoughts blurred as I walked through the streets of our small suburban town, my feet moving mechanically, carrying me farther and farther from the house I had lived in for 18 years. My mind kept circling back to the conversation that had just unfolded in the kitchen. The harsh words, the complete absence of understanding. The more I thought about it, the more my chest tightened. How had I gotten to this point? How had my parents, the people who were supposed to nurture and protect me, ended up pushing me away? I had always felt like the black sheep in my family. My parents were hardworking, pragmatic people who believed in stability, in following the rules, in building a future one step at a time. But for as long as I could remember, I had felt a pull in the opposite direction. I wasn't like them. I wasn't as driven by the same rigid expectations. I wanted to explore the world, to understand who I was outside the confines of school and grades. I wanted freedom, the kind of freedom that only came from making your own choices and living with the consequences. But now that freedom had been thrust upon me in the worst way possible. Unprepared, vulnerable, and alone. I walked for hours without really thinking about it, my mind so clouded with emotion that I hardly noticed the town fading behind me. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a part of the town I didn't recognize. The buildings became sparse, and the streets grew quieter. I had no idea where I was heading, but I felt a strange pull toward a small patch of woods at the edge of town. It was a place I had visited as a child, a place where I had once gone camping with friends. I knew it wasn't the ideal solution, but it felt like the only place I could go for now. Somewhere secluded, where I could be alone with my thoughts, away from the world that seemed so unforgiving. I reached the edge of the woods as the sky began to darken, the first stars appearing in the fading light. The cool breeze of the evening rustled the leaves above me, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my chest. This wasn't what I had imagined for myself. I had dreamed of adventure, but I hadn't planned for survival. I didn't have a plan for what came next. My parents had given me no preparation, no guidance, no support. They had simply sent me out into the world, expecting me to figure it out on my own. I stepped into the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet sounding unnaturally loud in the silence of the trees. I walked deeper, pushing past familiar paths and into a more secluded area where I had once camped with my friends. It was quiet here, isolated, and I knew that no one would find me if I didn't want them to. This place had always felt like a sanctuary, a retreat from the chaos of everyday life. But now it felt different. The trees seemed to loom larger, the shadows deeper, and the sense of calm I had once felt here was replaced by an overwhelming sense of fear. I hadn't thought about what I would need to survive in the woods. I didn't have any camping gear, no food, no water. The only thing I had was my duffel bag, which contained little more than a change of clothes and my phone. My phone was nearly dead and I didn't have a charger. I couldn't afford to waste the battery, so I powered it down and shoved it into the bag. Finding a spot to set up the tent was the first challenge. I didn't have a tent yet, and I had no idea where to get one. I had a vague memory of a camping supply store about a mile from where I was, but I had no way of getting there. I wasn't even sure if I had enough money for the tent, let alone for any other supplies I might need. I felt a wave of panic rise within me. This wasn't a camping trip. This was survival. And I wasn't prepared for this. I spent the next hour walking around the area, searching for anything I could use to make a shelter. There were some discarded branches and a few large rocks, but nothing that would keep me safe from the elements. The sun was nearly gone now, and I could feel the temperature drop rapidly. My body shivered as I tried to figure out what to do next. I needed to think. I needed to calm down. But the reality of the situation kept crashing over me, drowning out any logical thoughts I might have had. I walked back toward the edge of the woods, hoping to find some sign of civilization. But all I found was a small store that was just about to close. My heart sank as I pushed the door open. The store was dimly lit, and the shelves were stocked with camping gear. But everything was too expensive. I had just enough money to buy a cheap, basic tent, but it wasn't enough to cover any other supplies. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look, probably wondering why a young girl like me was buying a tent in the middle of the night. With the tent in hand, I returned to the woods and set up my shelter. The process was clumsy and frustrating. I hadn't set up a tent in years, and the wind was picking up, making it harder to stabilize the poles. It took longer than I expected, and by the time the tent was finally standing, I was exhausted, hungry, and cold. The reality of the situation had hit me hard, and I realized just how unprepared I was for this. I had no idea how I was going to survive out here, how I was going to make it through the coming days, weeks, or months. That night, I crawled into the tent and huddled inside the sleeping bag I had bought along with the tent. The air was cold, the ground hard beneath me, and I could hear the sounds of the forest around me. Rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a branch. It was quiet, eerily so. The isolation was suffocating. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming fear that kept creeping up on me. But every time I thought I could drift off, my mind would race again. I kept thinking about my parents, how they had just sent me away, without a second thought. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong. Had I really made that much of a mistake by wanting to take a year off? Had I really pushed them to this point? I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising, casting pale light into the tent. My body ached from the hard ground, and my head was heavy with exhaustion. I didn't feel rested. I didn't feel safe. And I didn't feel like I had any answers. I was lost. But one thing was clear. I had no choice but to keep going. There was no turning back. The first morning in the woods was colder than I expected. The tent offered little warmth, and the thin sleeping bag I had bought from the store barely kept the chill from seeping into my bones. My body ached from the hard ground, but the real ache was in my chest, an empty, hollow feeling that came from knowing I had no place to return to. I had always thought I would have a safety net, that if life ever knocked me down, I could come back home. But now, with no family to turn to, no friends nearby, and no real plan for the future, I felt as though I had been cut adrift in a vast, unfeeling sea. I rolled over in the tent, the fabric creaking as I moved. It was still dark outside, but the faint light of dawn was starting to creep in through the cracks in the fabric. I didn't want to think about what had led me here. I didn't want to dwell on the conversation with my parents, the hurtful words, the coldness in their eyes. All I could focus on now was surviving, finding food, keeping warm, and figuring out what to do next. The first thing I did was check my phone. It had no signal. Of course it didn't. The woods were far from any kind of reliable network. It had been foolish to think I could reach out to anyone for help. I hadn't told anyone where I was, and even if I had, I doubted anyone could come to my rescue. My friends were scattered, busy with their own lives, and my parents had made it very clear that they were done with me. I forced myself to get out of the tent, the cold air biting at my skin as soon as I stepped outside. The world was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel like a violation. The ground was damp with morning dew, and the trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I hadn't realized how alone I would feel out here. Even when I was surrounded by people, I'd often felt isolated, misunderstood. But now there was no one. It was just me, the woods, and a desperate desire to survive. I had no experience living off the land, no knowledge of how to make shelter or hunt for food. I didn't know how to navigate the woods, or what plants were safe to eat. I had always been someone who relied on others, on teachers, on my parents, on friends, to guide me through life. But now I had to rely on myself. I had no choice. I started walking, not really sure where I was going. The woods seemed endless, and every path looked the same. I tried to keep calm, to focus on the basics. I needed food, water, and shelter. The first priority was food. I couldn't go more than a day without eating, especially after the stress of the last few days had drained me. After a couple of hours of walking, I came across a small stream. The water was clear, flowing gently over the rocks, and it gave me a small sense of relief. At least I had water. I knelt beside the stream and cupped my hands, drinking greedily. The cold water was refreshing, but it didn't fill the emptiness inside me. I knew I couldn't rely on the stream alone. I needed something more. I spent the rest of the day looking for food. There were no berries or fruits that I recognized, and I didn't dare risk eating anything I wasn't sure about. I remembered my camping trips as a child, but I had never paid much attention to the practicalities of survival. I had always been more focused on having fun, on laughing with friends by the campfire, not on how to feed myself or find my way in the wilderness. I thought I could just survive off whatever I had brought with me, but I hadn't brought much, just a few granola bars, some snacks, and a bottle of water. It wasn't nearly enough. By the end of the first day, I was hungry and tired. My stomach growled with frustration, but I couldn't help it. I had no way of getting food. I couldn't afford to buy anything more. I had already spent most of my money on the tent and the bare essentials. The thought of being in this situation for longer than a few days was overwhelming. I couldn't let myself spiral, though. I had to stay focused. I made a fire that evening, using the limited knowledge I had about how to start one. It wasn't much, just a small flame that flickered weakly, but it gave me some warmth. The cold night air was sharp against my skin, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound I could hear. It was comforting in a way, but also isolating. The fire kept the darkness at bay, but it couldn't keep the loneliness from creeping in. I ate a granola bar and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The hunger gnawed at me, making it hard to relax. My thoughts kept returning to my parents. How could they have done this to me? How could they just send me out into the world without a second thought? I felt betrayed, abandoned. The anger I had felt in the moment when they kicked me out had faded into something deeper. A quiet sadness, a sense of loss. I didn't know how to move forward from here. Didn't know how to heal from this. The next morning, I decided I needed to try harder. I couldn't afford to sit around and feel sorry for myself. I had to figure this out. I started by exploring the area around the stream, hoping to find something edible. I had heard people talk about wild plants, mushrooms, and roots, but I had no idea where to look or how to identify them. I tried picking some wild herbs I found along the way, but they didn't look familiar, and I wasn't willing to risk making myself sick. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my stomach growling. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees, rocks, and underbrush. I felt like I was going in circles. Every time I thought I had found something promising, a patch of berries, a patch of mushrooms, I would approach it only to find it wasn't what I had hoped. I felt frustrated and defeated. How was I supposed to survive out here with no knowledge of the land, no supplies, no help? That afternoon, I stumbled across a small clearing where I found a patch of wild strawberries. They were small, but they were sweet, and for the first time in days I felt like I was doing something right. I picked as many as I could find, stuffing them into my mouth until my hunger was sated, if only for a short while. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since I had been kicked out, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I returned to the camp that evening, tired but determined. I set up my fire again, trying to make it last longer this time. As the fire crackled and the warmth spread through me, I felt a small sense of relief. The isolation still felt overwhelming, but the hunger had subsided, and the fire gave me something to focus on. That night, sleep came a little easier. My stomach was fuller than it had been in days, and I allowed myself a moment of peace. It wasn't much, but it was a small victory. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, that I couldn't continue to live off wild berries and small victories. But for the moment it was enough. For the first time I allowed myself to believe that maybe I could survive out here. Maybe, just maybe, I could do this. The next few days were a blur of trial and error. I spent my time learning how to make my shelter more stable, how to find food, and how to navigate the woods. I didn't know where I was going, or how long I could keep this up, but I was slowly adapting. The woods had become my home, and I was learning how to survive within them. But survival wasn't just about finding food or building shelter. It was about mental strength. And that was something I had to learn all over again. The isolation was the hardest part. I hadn't realized how much I relied on human connection until I was completely alone. The quiet was deafening. I missed hearing people's voices, the sounds of laughter, the warmth of familiar faces. The world had become smaller, more hostile. But it was also becoming mine. I had been in the woods for almost 3 weeks now. In some ways it felt like a lifetime, and in others it felt like just the beginning. The days blended together, some long and exhausting, others fleeting, filled with moments of clarity that left me questioning everything. As the days passed, I became accustomed to my new routine. Wake up early, gather water from the stream, find something to eat, and try to make the best of the small, makeshift camp I had set up. It wasn't perfect, but it was survival, and at this point, that's all I needed to focus on. The woods had become my world. They were my refuge from the chaos of the life I had once known. But I also knew that sooner or later, I would have to leave. I couldn't stay here forever. The thought of returning home felt like swallowing a bitter pill. But I also couldn't keep living this way. I needed something more: stability, a sense of normalcy, a future. There had to be a way out of this, a way forward. The isolation was taking its toll. At first, the quiet had been comforting, peaceful even. But now it felt like a constant weight on my shoulders. The woods were beautiful in their own way, but there was an unspoken loneliness that lingered in the air, something that gnawed at me when the sun went down and the fire crackled out. The longer I stayed here, the more I realized just how much I had taken for granted before. The simple things: human connection, the comfort of a familiar face, a place to call home. All of those things had been stripped away, leaving me with nothing but the wilderness and my own thoughts. I spent my days walking the trails, searching for food, and trying to figure out what my next step would be. I still had no real plan. I had no idea how to get back to civilization, how to find a way to reconnect with my family, or even if that was something I wanted anymore. What had they expected me to do when they kicked me out? They had given me nothing but the bare minimum: no support, no resources. How could they not understand that I wasn't ready to face the world alone? One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day of searching for food, I sat by the stream, the water rushing past me in a soothing, rhythmic flow. My stomach was still empty, and my body ached from the constant movement, but I didn't feel as desperate as I had when I first arrived. I had learned a lot in these past weeks: how to make a fire, how to forage for food, how to live with less. I had become resourceful, independent in ways I never thought possible. But I also knew I couldn't keep living like this forever. As I sat by the water, a thought struck me, as clear and as sudden as a thunderclap. It was the first time in weeks that I had allowed myself to truly think about what came next. I couldn't stay in the woods, but I also couldn't go back home. That door had closed maybe forever. But what if there was another option? I had always dreamed of escaping, of seeing the world beyond the small town I had grown up in. There was so much I wanted to experience, so much I wanted to do. And maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to start over, to carve out a life for myself on my own terms. I had no idea how I would get there, but I knew that I couldn't stay stuck in the woods, wallowing in my anger and frustration. It wasn't healthy, and it wasn't the life I wanted. I had to make a decision, either stay in this endless cycle of survival, or take a risk and go after what I wanted. The decision wasn't easy. It never is. But there was something inside me. Something stronger than fear, stronger than the doubt that had been gnawing at my mind, that told me it was time to take a leap. The next few days were spent preparing. I gathered all the supplies I could, my tent, the remnants of food I had left, and the small amount of money I still had, and began my journey out of the woods. I had no real destination in mind, but I was determined to find something more. Something that wasn't defined by the past or the mistakes I had made. It wasn't easy. The path was treacherous at times, the terrain rough and unforgiving. But there was a new sense of purpose in my steps, a new energy that I hadn't felt before. I had spent so much time surviving that I had forgotten what it felt like to live. And now, I was ready to live again. When I finally reached the outskirts of the woods, I found myself standing at the edge of something new. The town I had grown up in was still miles away, and I could have turned back, could have gone home, but I didn't. I knew that I had to keep going forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. I spent the next few weeks traveling, hitching rides from kind strangers and using the last of my money to stay in hostels or camp when necessary. Every day felt like a new challenge but also a new opportunity. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I had control over my life, that I was the one calling the shots. Along the way, I learned more about myself than I had ever imagined. I learned that I was stronger than I thought, more capable than I had ever given myself credit for. I had survived the woods and I could survive whatever came next. I still didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. Eventually, I ended up in a small city, a place far from the life I had known. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. I found a job working at a cafe and started to build a new life from the ground up. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I questioned everything, when I wanted to give up and go back to the safety of what I had known. But each time I thought about returning to the past, I reminded myself of the lessons I had learned in the woods, the strength I had discovered within myself, the resilience I had forged through hardship. I didn't need to go back home. I had survived. I had found my way out of the darkness and into the light. In time, I started to rebuild relationships with the people I had left behind. Some of them understood why I had disappeared. Others didn't. But that was okay. I had learned that my path wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations, not even my parents. I was no longer the person I had been when I first stepped into the woods. I was different now, stronger, more independent, more self-aware. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the loneliness crept back in. But I had found a new sense of belonging, one that came from within, not from external validation. I had learned to live on my own terms, and that was the most important lesson of all. I didn't know what the future held, but I was no longer afraid to face it. I had proven to myself that I could survive, that I could rise above whatever life threw my way. And in the end, that was all that mattered.